Right. The sermon this morning is faithfulness in the workplace. So we're in Luke chapter 16 at the moment. So I just hope my voice holds up today. I have not been well for quite some time, and I was a bit concerned about this Sunday whether I'd be okay to preach, but I'm feeling a lot better, and I just hope my voice holds up for the whole sermon. So Luke 16, starting in verse 1, the Bible reads, "And he said also unto his disciples, there was a certain rich man which had a steward, and the same was accused unto him that he had wasted his goods. And he called him and said unto him, How is it that I hear this of thee? Give an account of thy stewardship, for thou mayest be no longer steward." So here we've got this unjust steward. He hasn't taken care of his master's business the way he ought to, and he's being fired. His boss has had enough. He's had enough of him wasting his goods. And if we continue on in verse 3, "Then the steward said within himself, What shall I do? For my Lord taketh away from me the stewardship. I cannot dig, to beg I am ashamed. I am resolved what to do, that when I am put out of the stewardship, that they may receive me into their houses. So he called every one of his Lord's debtors unto him, and said unto the first, How much owest thou unto my Lord? And he said, 100 measures of oil. And he said unto him, Take thy bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to another, And how much owest thou? And he said, 100 measures of wheat. And he said unto them, Take thy bill and write 80. So here we can see this steward has just been told that he's going to be fired. So in his last moments that he's got available working for the rich man, he makes a decision to recoup some of the losses, right, for his boss. Instead of just cutting and running and just trying to find another job, he's concerned firstly about whether or not he's even going to find another job. Because if he's done a bad job for this employer, then, word gets around and he might not get a job elsewhere, right? So he's like, okay, what can he do? How can he best make, turn this situation that's really bad into something that might actually benefit him? Right, now that's his motivation. He's only thinking of himself. He's not necessarily thinking of, the employer here. He's just thinking, how can I recover some of the losses for my employer, save a little bit of face, but then also gain favour in the eyes of these people that have got this debt to my employer. So he comes up with this idea where he's just going to go do some debt collection, but he's only going to collect half, right? So that way the people that owe the debt, they feel, some gratitude towards him, and then at least his boss can also recover some of the losses, right? So he's motivated, he's just thinking of himself, right? He's not necessarily thinking of his boss or, these other people. He's thinking of what can he get out of this situation that he's got himself into. Now, as believers, we really should never find ourselves in this situation that this unjust steward finds himself in. All right? We really shouldn't, right? So here's a parable about, and when we continue reading this, Jesus is illustrating that sometimes the people in the world, when we get to that verse, basically they make the best of some bad situations, whereas sometimes we as believers don't see these things because we're not necessarily as selfish as this unjust steward to think about these sorts of things at times. And I think that's what this parable is a little bit about. It's about being wise and smart and not letting others take advantage of you. And here, the problem with this man was that he was never really probably invested in this rich man's business. He didn't really care about it. I mean, if he's got a bunch of debtors that owe a heap of money and he's allowed it to get to that state, he hasn't really cared about the rich man's business at all. Who knows what thoughts are going through his mind? Maybe he thinks that the rich man's too rich anyway. He's got enough wealth. What does it matter if, there's a few people that owe him some money? He's just got so much wealth anyway. What does it matter? Who knows what was going through his mind? But these are the sort of things that might have gone through his mind. And the sermon today, obviously, faithfulness in the workplace. With your employer, it doesn't matter whether they're super wealthy or not all that wealthy or whatever their situation is, we can't take for granted our position in the workplace and think, oh, my boss is well set, he's really wealthy, what does it matter if if I'm lazy on the job, if I'm slothful, if I don't really care about the finances, and if there's some losses here or there, he'll still be fine. That's not the attitude we ought to have. But that's the situation this unjust steward finds himself in. And in fact, in the Bible itself, we've got plenty of examples of believers that are great examples of being a good steward. When you think about someone like Daniel or Joseph in the Old Testament, these are believers that took it very seriously when they were given any sort of responsibility, no matter what the responsibility was. Now Joseph, even when he was in prison, he's a prisoner. He even took responsibility in prison and earned the favour of the warden of the prison. So it doesn't matter what situation we're in, whether we're in a nice situation or end up in prison, what the attitude we ought to have in our workplace, wherever that may be, is to really take responsibility and ownership. Really take responsibility and ownership, just like Daniel and Joseph. And then in verse 8, what we find after the unjust steward has recovered some of the losses, in verse 8, and the Lord commended the unjust steward because he had done wisely. For the children of this world are in their generation wiser than the children of light. So why was he commended? Well, a couple of reasons. For one, he recovered some of the debts. If he'd had the attitude of just cutting and running and just trying to find another job and just, he could have been ashamed about what he'd done. He could easily just think, I'm out of here. But no, he took at least some responsibility. Of course, it was all for self-motivation, but at least he did that. So he recovered some debts, and also, in this situation, the unjust steward, he left in a better standing with the rich man and the debtors. If he'd just cut and run, his boss, the rich man, would have thought he was just some wicked, useless servant. And also the debtors, well, with them, he hasn't given them an opportunity to actually pay the debt off and clear the debt. So he's not going to get any favours from them, even though because they owe the rich man the money, right? They've got no debt to him. So he's done this, he's very wise, he's very smart in the way he's gone about this, even though he shouldn't have got in the situation in the first place. And us as believers, we really need to, this is a parable for us. Jesus is trying to teach us something here. And as believers, I think at times it's too easy for us to think that something just hasn't worked out, or we can just, that's right, I'll just trust God that he'll open another door, it'll be okay. Rather than if we've let someone down, say our employer, we've got ourselves into a bit of a mess at work, whatever the situation may be, we've made a big mistake, we've cost the company a whole heap of money, take ownership and see if you can rectify it. See if you can help mitigate some of the damage that might have been caused by what you've done in the workplace, whatever that case may be. Now, obviously, we want to avoid those sorts of things happening, but if that's your situation, take responsibility. Try and mitigate some of the losses. Care about and get invested in the business that you're working for. Because at the end of the day, whatever your job is, wherever you're working, it is in your best interest to try and help the company and care about how that company is going to perform, because you get your income from that company anyway. Right? Now in verse 9 it continues, and I say unto you, make to yourselves friends of the mammon of unrighteousness, that when ye fail, they may receive you unto everlasting habitations. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. If therefore ye have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? And if you have not been faithful in that which is another man's, who shall give you that which is your own? And this is a powerful lesson here. This is because as believers, I know for myself, I can sometimes have that sort of attitude of it's just money, God doesn't really care about money, the riches of this world, he doesn't really care about it. So what does it matter if, I might be a little bit lazy on the job, or, not help the company really advance or perform or really attain what it should be attaining. I could have that sort of attitude. But here, what we're being taught through this by Jesus is that the level of respect that we have for the workplace and the finances and how that company performs and the responsibilities we've got within that company, God doesn't care about the money, but he cares about our attitude in the workplace. He cares about our attitude towards it and whether we take responsibility or not. That's what he cares about. And he knows our hearts. He knows if we really do care and if we can be trusted. According to this parable, we have to be shown that we can be trusted with the unrighteous mammon in this world, before God's going to actually trust us with true riches. That's what this parable's all about. And in this situation, and here's the thing, if you're faithful in the workplace and you can be a person of responsibility and really take ownership, and God can see that, then He's going to reward you with more opportunities in the workplace and also in the house of God. That's what this is teaching. And in verse 13, so that people don't misunderstand what this parable is about, Jesus in verse 13 makes it very clear that no servant can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. Jesus is teaching that our motivation in the workplace, it's not to make a lot of money. Our motivation in the workplace ought to be one, and we're going to start looking at some motivations, the reasons why we go to work, and biblically what our attitude should be, what really should drive us to be great performers at work and be faithful in the workplace. But it's pretty clear that we're not doing it for the love of money, or we shouldn't be, according to what Jesus is teaching here. So let's have a look at some of the motivators. What is it that should be motivating us in the workplace? Because if it's not the money, what is it? And obviously, from verse 13, we can see that, if we go to Proverbs 28, go to Proverbs chapter 28. Proverbs 28, starting in verse 19. He that tilleth his land shall have plenty of bread, but he that followeth after vain persons shall have poverty enough. A faithful man shall abound with blessings, but he that maketh haste to be rich shall not be innocent. To have respect of persons is not good, for a piece of bread that man will transgress. He that hasteth to be rich hath an evil eye, and considereth not that poverty shall come upon him. Proverbs 28 here, there's this sort of contrast between, the one that works the land, that does the labour, that does the work, he's going to have plenty. He'll be taken care of, he'll be fine. Compared with someone that follows after vain persons. Because you know what it's like. You get some people that might come into your life that might have some ideas on how you can make a quick buck. Get rich quick schemes. All sorts of crazy stuff. There's some crazy ideas out there. And people get hooked into this stuff. People do get sucked in by this vanity, is what the Bible describes it as. Because what the Lord wants us to be doing is labour. He doesn't want us to earn a quick buck. He wants us to earn it through labour, which takes time. It's time consuming. It's not something that you just get rich quick, get rich overnight sort of situation, which is vain according to the Bible. And this is why our motivation for work, one, is just to do labour, to be busy at work. And obviously to provide for your family. Because here it says in verse 9, he that tilleth the land shall have plenty of bread. So there's plenty of provision for the family, right, when we go to work, when we labour. Don't turn there, but Proverbs 13:11, wealth gotten by vanity shall be diminished, but he that gathereth by labour shall increase. Now, I think this is applicable to the believer, because there are people in this world that do gain a lot of wealth by vanity. But for the believer, if we ever gain it by vanity, I'm telling you now, it'll be diminished. That's what the Bible's teaching here. But he that gathereth by labour shall increase. So there's no get-rich-quick schemes for the believer. Just won't work. God will see to it. Proverbs 12:11, he that tilleth the land shall be satisfied with bread, but he that followeth vain persons is void of understanding. So the Bible's saying if you get sucked in by these vain people that have got these get-rich-quick schemes, where you can avoid doing the hard work, try and avoid doing the labour, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Accumulating wealth takes time. And when you think about some of these get-rich... And here's the thing, there's nothing wrong with accumulating some wealth. And we'll get to that. But if that's your motivation, you've got a real problem as a believer, and you are going to find roadblocks every step of the way in your life as a believer. God will see to it that there'll be just roadblock after roadblock after roadblock if that's your motivation, if that's what's in your heart. And, in the past, I'll admit it, I've been one of these people that was sucked into things like multi-level marketing schemes, and it was just always from one thing to the next. I never went into any of these sorts of schemes full time. They were always something that was in the background, that I was complementing with my main line of work. But, it's amazing just how easily you can get sucked into those things if your motivation is all wrong and twisted and warped. You can get sucked into these things. If you're trying to just earn a heap of money and be rich in this world, as a believer, you can get sucked into these sorts of things. You don't want to find yourself doing that. And in 1 Timothy 6:6, here's a warning. This is a warning about those that want to be rich. 1 Timothy 6:6, but godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be there with content. But they that will be rich fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after, they have erred from the faith and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. This is a pretty strong warning. And the Bible's teaching us as believers here, if we want to be rich, we'll fall into this temptation and we'll be pierced with many griefs. So just this morning, if this applies to you, check your heart. Make sure you try and change your motivations. Really, you don't want to be desiring to be rich. Now, what's another motivation? I've touched on this just briefly at the start, but if we go to 1 Timothy 5, verse 8, so just flick back a chapter. 1 Timothy 5, verse 8. So we should be working hard to provide for our families. Be a great provider, right? Now, if you're single and you don't have a family, well, it still should be your goal. Because you should be aiming to have a family in the future. Unless you're a eunuch, in which case you're super special, which is possible, but that's rare. That's extremely rare. So if you're a single person, this still applies to you. You should be thinking about how you're going to possibly provide for a family in the future. Right? You need to be able to put yourself in that position before you even get married. In 1 Timothy 5:8 it reads, but if any provide not for his own, and especially for those of his own house, he hath denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. Now, I can't think of a worse descriptor of a believer than being worse than an infidel. So this is extremely serious here. This commandment to provide for our own is obviously, it's right up there. It's right up there amongst the commandments, because you're worse than an unbeliever if you're not providing for your family. So if you find yourself in a situation where you're without work and a job, your full-time job is to find work, to provide for your family. That's your job. That's what it is. That's your full-time job. You shouldn't be doing anything else, obviously, besides you still need to come to church. Don't forget that. But outside of coming to the house of God full-time, you should be looking for work. And in 2 Thessalonians 3:10, for even when we were with you, this we commanded you, that if any would not work, neither should he eat. So there's no freeloading. If you're not working, you're not going to get handouts. That's biblical. So if you're in this church and you're without work and you're not looking for work and you're expecting to get free handouts, you're out of luck. It's not going to happen. Verse 11, for we hear that there are some which walk among you disorderly, working not at all, but are busybodies. Now them that are such we command and exhort by our Lord Jesus Christ, that with quietness they work and eat their own bread. But ye, brethren, be not weary in well-doing, and if any man obey not our word by this epistle, note that man and have no company with him, that he may be ashamed. All right, so another one is work hard to be a good example in the workplace. So your example in the workplace is extremely important as a believer. And in Matthew 5:16, it says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. Now this applies for all of our good works, but obviously in the workplace, this applies to your productivity in the workplace. You know, what are you known for in the workplace? Are you known as somebody that's a hard worker? Do people look at you, or, you know, do people say things about you that you're a hard worker? Is that the sort of conversation that goes on in the workplace? Or is it more the opposite, that you're a bit of a loafer, you don't take it seriously, you're not all that productive, you're not very efficient in the workplace? What are people saying about you? Because your testimony as a believer is super important. And if in the workplace you've got a reputation of being a bit lazy, a bit aloof, not serious, you know, not productive, people aren't going to take you seriously. It damages your testimony. It really has the potential to damage your testimony in the workplace. And obviously it depends on your workplace. I mean, there's some workplaces are different than others. I'm in an office with a lot of people. So if I was lazy, aloof, and unproductive, then there's a lot of eyes and ears that are going to see it. You know, and that's going to have a real negative impact on me, my testimony, the things that I've got to share about the Lord in the workplace with my work colleagues, right? When I get that sort of opportunity. This is why it's super important. Now, obviously, if you're working for yourself, it's a bit of a different situation again. But I guess if you're working for yourself, you should even be more productive, because you've got the self-motivation as well as also the motivation to be a good example for the Lord, work for the Lord. And in Colossians 3:22, here it addresses servants. Servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in singleness of heart, fearing God. And whatsoever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord, and not unto men, knowing that of the Lord ye shall receive the reward of the inheritance, for ye serve the Lord Christ. But he that doeth wrong shall receive the wrong which he hath done, and there is no respect of persons. So here's addressing servants and how they should be with their masters. And for those that, I mean, it's not something that's really in our country, slavery. But in a sense, we're all servants to our bosses at work anyway. They're paying us for our service. But even if you're a servant, you're an unpaid servant in the sense of maybe monetary terms, but maybe you've got lodging and you've got food and they keep, giving you clothing. In that sort of situation, the Bible here is teaching, obey your master. Now, I think it'd be pretty unusual if any of us found ourselves in that sort of situation in Australia, in some kind of slavery, but here the point the Bible's making is you're going to be rewarded in heaven. And for us, even if our boss doesn't see the hard work we put in at work and maybe doesn't notice what we do, and we're putting in a real serious effort and taking it really seriously, the Lord can see it, and He'll reward you. If your earthly boss doesn't reward you, your heavenly Father will. And this is backed up in Ephesians 6 verse 5, where it says, "Servants, be obedient to them that are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and singleness of heart, as unto Christ." I'll just read that. I think I've doubled up here. I think I've got to double up, so I'll ignore that. Turn to Romans chapter 12. Romans 12. So I've talked about productivity. Romans chapter 12. Now, in the workplace, you can have all sorts of different employees in the workplace. And some people, with the allotted time they've got at work, from 9 to 5 or whatever hours they might be, work really hard, very productively, are very efficient, and try and get everything done within that allotted time. Right? When they leave at the end of the day, they want to feel like, okay, I've tied up all the loose ends, I'm ready for the next day, I'm good to go for tomorrow. And then there's others that they don't work as hard as they could within that allotted time. And you know what? They might even have to do some overtime to get on top of their work, and their boss might even have to pay them for that. Right? Some people deliberately do this sort of stuff, where they'll be just less productive during that time that they've got, thinking, yeah, well, I'm working as hard as that guy, so I'll just work as hard as him, and then I'll be able to do some overtime as well, and I'll get paid more for that. And it's leeching. It's just leeching off your boss. Good. Now, it's easy to fall into that trap because others might be doing it. As a believer, you want to be different than that in your workplace. You want to be someone that's known for being extremely productive in the time that you're given. Get as much done as you can in that time. I promise you, it will not go unnoticed when you've got other employees that don't have the same attitude. You're the one that'll get the promotion. You're the one that'll get the pay increase while they're doing the overtime, right, to make up for the work that they should have done within the allotted time. You're the one getting the pay increase and you're still only working the 9 to 5 hours. I promise you that's how it will work. It won't go unnoticed. But here's the other thing too. If you're the only believer in your workplace, you should be the best worker in your workplace. There should be nobody else in your workplace that outshines you. There really shouldn't. For starters, you've got more motivation. You've got the Lord. You've got rewards in heaven that you can lay up for yourselves. There's far more motivation for us as believers. So if this is you, if in your workplace you're aware that there are definitely people that work harder than you in the workplace, then you need to change your attitude. You really need to try and change your attitude in the workplace. Try and be the best in your workplace. And once again, think about Daniel and Joseph. If we were given more information in the Old Testament about what they did and the things they did and the responsibilities they took, I promise you they're hard workers. There's no way they would have got to the position they got to unless they were hard workers, took responsibility and took it seriously. And that's how we ought to be. And in Romans 12:11 it says, not slothful in business, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. Serving the Lord. That's who we serve. Proverbs 18:9, he also that is slothful in his work is brother to him that is a great waster. Like the unjust steward. The unjust steward was a slothful individual. Because remember the words of the rich man, he wasted his money. He was wasteful. He was a brother of him that is a great waster. Slothful people are wasteful people. And Proverbs 22:13, Sam used this verse in his sermon this morning. He must have memorised this one because I think he just came from memory. But Proverbs 22:13, the slothful man saith, there is a lion without. I shall be slain in the streets. People can come up with all sorts of crazy excuses. Absolutely crazy excuses not to do the work or not go to work, whatever they may be. Here you've got there's a lion in the street. No, I can't do anything. I can't do anything because I might be killed. It's like the dog ate my homework type of scenario. There's all sorts of excuses people come up with. Don't be that person. Do not be that person. You don't want to be somebody that tries to come up with excuses because they get old and your employer is going to get sick of it. If you're that person, if you're someone that just likes to try and come up with different excuses, it'll get old with your employer. And you might end up in that same situation that the unjust steward found himself in where you get fired. If you ever leave a job, you don't want to leave it because you got fired, right? If you're made redundant, that's different. The company might just have to cut back and they're suffering losses, whatever. But if you leave your workplace, you want to be somebody that leaves it because you chose to leave, because maybe there was a better opportunity elsewhere, maybe you're moving somewhere else or whatever the case may be. You don't want to be the person that got fired because you weren't doing a good job. Philippians chapter 2, verse 14. Now, actually, before we go there, something else I want to bring up too is mobile phones. Mobile phones. Now, I don't have one, so this isn't a problem for me, but I'm blessed. I've got a job where I don't need to have a phone. So I've got a landline at work. I don't need to have a phone. If people need to get in touch with me, they can get in touch with me. But in my particular workplace, I see everyone has a mobile phone. We've got a workplace where our employers allow the employees to have mobile phones, use them, take calls, send messages and whatnot. And there are certain people in the workplace that are just constantly on the phone. Right. It's such a bad look, right? Now I think the mindset is they think they're getting away with it because there's others that do it as well. But there are definitely some that do it a lot more than others and spend a lot more time on that phone when they ought not to be. And my recommendation is this: if you do have a mobile phone, if you don't need it on during work hours, turn it off. Just turn it off, right? It's just such a bad look. And I'm not even their employer, but I walk around the office and I see someone on their phone And they sort of look up and they're like, and then they're back on the screen. You know, it's like, oh, somebody saw me on my phone again. Because they're constantly on their phone. Such a bad look. Don't be that person. If you can, during your work hours, shut your phone off. Some people have got jobs where they've got to use the phone, they've got to have the phone on. That's fine. You know, obviously in those sorts of situations, my recommendation would be when people do call you for personal calls, try and advise people, hey, call me during lunch. Or call me just after I finish work, or maybe just before work, or maybe morning tea, whatever it may be. Let people know when you are available. If it's an emergency situation, that's fine. I get that. But let people know when you're available instead of consuming the time that your employer is paying you to work. And also, when the boss asks us to do things at work, sometimes they can ask us to do things that we might not like doing. Some tasks that might be a little bit unpleasant, some tasks that we might think might be a little bit beneath us. In Philippians 2:14 it says, "Do all things without murmurings and disputings, that ye may be blameless and harmless, the sons of God, without rebuke in the midst of a crooked and perverse nation, among whom ye shine as lights in the world." So we ought to shine as lights. We ought to be different. So, you know, when the boss asks somebody to do something and it's a dreadful task or something that's, you know, pretty ordinary, something to do, as long as it's not sinful, you should do it without murmuring and dispute. And if you've got that kind of attitude in the workplace, you'll go places and you'll have an impact, you'll be a good example, you'll shine as a light in the world because you're going to stand out from the others. You'll stand out from other employees in the workplace. Now, here's something for the mothers and wives. Is obviously you've got a workplace as well. So it's not just us that go out and earn a wage. In fact, your job's probably more important than ours. Besides the provision that the family needs, obviously, by us men going out to work and earning the money, but mothers have got an incredibly important job. Incredibly important job, the keepers at home. And in Titus 2:3, it reads, "The aged women likewise, that they be in behaviour as becometh holiness, not false accusers, not given to much wine, teachers of good things, that they may teach the young women to be sober, to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, keepers at home, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God be not blasphemed." So the role for women, for wives, for mothers, is keepers at home. That's your job. Now, according to the Bible, that's your full-time job. And you ought to take it seriously. And what's different for the women, I think, especially while the husbands are at work, is that they really have no overseer at home while the husband's at work. The husband can't see what they're doing or what they're up to. So they have to be somebody that really takes a lot of responsibility, takes that role seriously, because they don't have somebody watching them. So in some ways, it's a little bit more difficult to be super productive, I think, and be really with it and not get distracted and be on the ball. Now, you can take rest, you can take breaks, you can, you know, if you need to have a rest, amen, have a rest. But your focus in the home should be no different than the husband's focus at work. It should be no different. And in 1 Timothy 5:14, it also says, "I will therefore that the younger women marry, bear children, guide the house. Give none occasion to the adversary to speak reproachfully." So if you're doing your job as a woman, as a mother, as a wife in the house, then people can't speak reproachfully. What they will say about you is, "She is a great mother. What a great wife she is. She really takes care of the children. She's on the ball, she's sharp, she's productive in the home. And in Proverbs 6 verse 6, this is what I'm talking about no overseer, and why I think the challenge for women can be a little bit greater at times to be super productive. Proverbs 6 verse 6, "Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, which having no guide, overseer, or ruler, provideth her meat in the summer and gathereth her food in the harvest. How long wilt thou sleep, O sluggard? When wilt thou arise out of thy sleep? Yet a little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to sleep, so shall thy poverty come as one that travaileth, and thy want as an armed man." So there it is. You've got the example of the ant in this proverb, which has no overseer, no ruler, yet the ant is super, super productive. Super productive. I don't think you'll ever see an ant standing still. They're always moving. They're always on the move. So be like the ant. Now here's another thing too. Now, talking about being productive and our work hours and that sort of thing, and I really believe this with all my heart. If you're super productive in the workplace, you can get your work done in the allotted time. Or what can happen too, because your employee can see what you can get done in that allotted time, he's going to start looking for employees that can get the same level of work done. You'll attract that sort of person to the business. And what that means too is that you're not going to have to work the overtime. You don't need to do the extra hours. The company can still produce the same output and you can earn even more money in that same allotted time. You've just got to think more, bigger picture, not just as an employee in the workplace. This is what I believe. But that being said, you don't want to be a workaholic. You do not want to be a workaholic. You don't want to be someone that's working 3 jobs. I don't believe anyway. This is what I believe. People can talk to me about this after the service if they like. I don't think you want to be that kind of person, and I don't think the Bible teaches this either. I don't think it teaches us to be workaholics. And in Ecclesiastes, if you want to turn to Ecclesiastes chapter 1. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, in verse 2. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labour which he taketh under the sun? The question is asked. And Solomon answers this. In chapter 5, in verse 18, it reads, Behold that which I have seen, it is good and comely for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labour that he taketh under the sun. Amen. All the days of his life, which God giveth him, for it is his portion. Every man also to whom God hath given riches and wealth, and hath given him power to eat thereof, and to take his portion, and to rejoice in his labour, this is the gift of God. Good. The fruit of our labour, according to the Bible, is the gift of God. What we receive through the hours that we put in the workplace is the gift of God, and God wants us to enjoy it. He doesn't want us to be that workaholic working 3 jobs and earning all this money and not being able to enjoy the fruit of our labour. So just to reiterate, you want to be the kind of person that's super productive in the allotted time you've got at work, for the sake of your employer, for the sake of the business, also because you're serving the Lord. And then, once you receive that, the Lord wants you to enjoy what you've received from that. He wants to enjoy the provisions. It's His gift to you. It's His gift. Now, your employer might be paying you, but the Bible's saying it's the gift of God because you're serving the Lord. And this is where faith comes into it, serving the Lord, do everything with all your heart in the workplace because God will reward you. And look, if it turns out that you've just got a nasty employer that just doesn't want to give you that pay rise, even though you're doing everything possible to avoid having to work a second job or whatever your situation might be, I can promise you this, you will not go unrewarded because the Lord will open another door somewhere. Some other company, some other employer is going to hear about your hard work in this business and he'll want it. He'll headhunt you. You'll get opportunities elsewhere, even if you've got a nasty employer. So, look, it was only going to be sort of a short sermon this morning, but just to recap, first of all, you want to be a great provider. You want to be somebody that can provide for your household at home. That's what you want to be known for as a father, as a husband, and even as a single person that eventually aims to get married. Eventually, you've got to start being a provider before God's going to give you that responsibility. Right? You want to start putting yourself in that position. So that's you, young people, young men. That's Caleb, Matt, you guys. And I'm sure that's what you're doing. I've heard about you, Caleb. I know you're a hard worker. I've heard. So, yeah, be that good example in the workplace. It'll eventually go noticed, even if it might be unnoticed for a period of time. It'll eventually be noticed. Check your motivations. As I said earlier in the sermon, do not hasten to be rich. Your motivation for going to the workplace, being a really hard worker, is to provide for your family, Your motivation is to serve the Lord. Your motivation is not to make a whole heap of money. That's not why you go to work. And work as if for the Lord. Amen. Let's pray.